The blood-curdling scream echoed through the dusty streets of Brownsville, Texas, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot, including Mason Blackett, who had been tying his horse outside the general store when the commotion began. Mason's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his hip. The year was 1873, and Brownsville, situated on the very edge of the Rio Grande, was still rough around the edges despite its growing prosperity. The scream had come from the direction of the boarding house at the end of the street, and without hesitation, Mason abandoned his errand and strode purposefully toward the sound. As he approached, he could see a small crowd gathering. A young woman, heavily pregnant and clearly distressed, was being forcibly removed from the boarding house by a red-faced landlady who was shouting loud enough for the entire town to hear. "I told you I don't rent to your kind. Unmarried and with child. The very disgrace. Get your belongings and be gone from my establishment." The young woman, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face, clutched a small valise to her chest, with one hand, while the other protectively covered her swollen belly. Her honey-brown hair fell in disarray around her shoulders, and her simple calico dress was travel-worn and dusty. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I have nowhere else to go. My husband is dead. Please, just one night." The landlady's face contorted with anger. "A likely story. I know your type. Probably don't even know who the father is." Mason felt his jaw tighten as he watched the scene unfold. He had seen enough. Pushing through the crowd, he approached the two women. "That's enough," he said firmly, his deep voice cutting through the commotion. "There's no call for treating anyone like this, especially not a woman in her condition." The landlady turned her ire on him. "Stay out of this, Blackett. This ain't your concern." "I'm making it my concern," Mason replied evenly. He turned to the young woman, whose tearful eyes were now fixed on him, with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Madam, I'm Mason Blackett. I have a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. If you need a place to stay, you're welcome there." The woman hesitated, looking uncertain. I couldn't impose. I don't even know you, sir." Mason removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair with traces of sun-bleached strands. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, lives on the property. You'd be perfectly proper and safe. Truth is, my ranch needs a family." He paused, aware of how forward he was being. "What I mean to say is, it's a big place, too big for just me, and Mrs. Finch could use the company." The young woman studied him, seeming to assess whether he could be trusted. Mason stood steadily under her scrutiny, his weathered face open and honest. "I'm Rose," she finally said. "Rose Dawson. My husband Thomas died 3 months ago. I was trying to make it to my cousin in San Antonio, but the stagecoach left me here when I got sick yesterday." Mason nodded. "Well, Mrs. Dawson, my offer stands, at least until you're well enough to continue your journey, if that's still your wish." The landlady snorted derisively. "Taking in strays now, Blackett? She'll rob you blind." Mason turned a hard stare on the woman. "Mrs. Hargrove, I believe you have a business to run. Perhaps you'd be better served attending to it rather than standing in the street making a spectacle." A few chuckles from the crowd caused Mrs. Hargrove's face to redden further, but she huffed and turned back toward her boarding house, muttering under her breath. Rose wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Mason placed his hat back on his head. "My mother raised me to believe that a person's character is measured by how they treat those in need." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Besides, like I said, the ranch is too quiet these days." Rose looked around at the curious onlookers, then back at Mason. Her shoulders sagged slightly, whether from relief or resignation, he couldn't tell. "I accept your offer, Mr. Blackett, but only until I can arrange passage to San Antonio." Mason nodded. "That's fair. Do you have more luggage somewhere?" Rose shook her head. "Just this," she said, lifting the small valise slightly. Everything else was sold to pay for Thomas's doctor bills and burial. Something in Mason's chest tightened at her words. He'd known hardship himself, but the thought of this young widow having to sell her possessions to bury her husband while carrying his child struck him particularly hard. "I need to finish my errands in town, then we can head to the ranch. Would you like to wait at the cafe, get something to eat?" Rose hesitated, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach again. I don't have much money left." "My treat," Mason said quickly. "Mrs. Patterson makes the best apple pie in the county. Seems to me you could use something sweet right about now." For the first time, Rose's lips curved into a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blackett. That's very kind." Mason led her to the cafe, aware of the whispers and stares following them. Brownsville wasn't a large town, and gossip traveled faster than wildfire in dry grass. By sundown, everyone would be talking about how Mason Blackett had taken in the pregnant widow. But as he watched Rose settle into a chair at the cafe, her posture straight despite her circumstances, her chin lifted with quiet dignity, Mason found he didn't much care what anyone thought. The ranch did need a family. And perhaps, though he wasn't ready to admit it even to himself, so did he. Mason completed his errands as quickly as possible, not wanting to leave Rose waiting too long. He picked up the supplies he needed from the general store: coffee, flour, sugar, and some fabric that Mrs. Finch had requested for new curtains. He also stopped by the mercantile, and after a moment's hesitation, purchased a shawl. The evenings could get chilly at the ranch, even in the Texas spring, and Rose's thin dress wouldn't provide much warmth. When he returned to the cafe, he found Rose exactly where he'd left her, though her plate was now empty and she was sipping a cup of tea. Her eyes seemed less haunted than they had been, and some color had returned to her cheeks. "Feeling better?" he asked, setting his packages down. Rose nodded. "Yes, thank you. Mrs. Patterson's pie was delicious, just as you said. She also brought me some soup that wasn't on the menu." Mason smiled. Eliza Patterson has a soft heart, especially for those in need. He gestured to his packages. "I'm all set if you're ready to go." Rose stood carefully, one hand supporting her back. Mason estimated she must be at least 7 months along, if not more. The journey to the ranch might be uncomfortable for her in her condition. "My wagon's this way," he said, picking up his packages in one arm and offering her the other for support. Rose hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his forearm. Mason was immediately struck by how small and delicate her hand was against the rough fabric of his shirt. He was not a particularly large man, standing just under 6 feet, but Rose was petite, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. They walked slowly to where his wagon was hitched. Mason helped Rose up onto the seat, then loaded his purchases in the back. As he climbed up beside her, he noticed she was looking around at the town with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "How long have you been in Brownsville?" he asked as he took up the reins. "Just since yesterday. The stagecoach was heading to San Antonio, but I started feeling ill when we stopped here. The driver said they couldn't wait, so they left me." Her voice held no bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. "That wasn't right of them," Mason said, clicking his tongue to start the horses moving. Rose shrugged slightly. "The driver did help me to the boarding house before they left. I thought I'd be able to stay there until I felt better, but—" She trailed off. "Mrs. Hargrove has strong opinions about what's proper," Mason said diplomatically. "She's not wrong about me being unmarried," Rose said quietly, her gaze fixed ahead. "My wedding ring was one of the things I had to sell." Mason glanced at her sharply. "That doesn't give anyone the right to treat you the way she did." Rose's eyes met his, surprise evident in them. "You're a rare sort of man, Mr. Blackett." "Mason," he corrected her. "And I'm just a man who was raised right. Nothing rare about that." He paused, then asked gently, "If you don't mind my asking, what happened to your husband?" Rose's hand returned to her belly, a gesture Mason was beginning to recognize as protective or comforting. "Thomas was a carpenter. We lived in Houston. There was an accident at a building site, a beam fell. He lingered for almost 2 weeks before." Her voice caught, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "The doctor bills took everything we had saved. After the funeral, there was nothing left to keep up the rent on our home." Mason nodded, understanding now why she was traveling to San Antonio. "And your cousin there, they'll take you in?" "Rebecca's husband owns a hotel. She wrote that they could use help with the bookkeeping, and they have a room where the baby and I could stay." Rose's voice held a note of uncertainty. "At least, that was the plan 3 weeks ago when I wrote to tell her I was coming. I haven't received a reply." Mason kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he frowned. It wasn't uncommon for mail to be delayed or lost entirely in these parts, but he couldn't help wondering if Rose's cousin was as welcoming as Rose hoped. They passed out of the town limits and onto the road that would take them to his ranch. The landscape opened up around them, rolling hills covered in spring grass, patches of wildflowers adding splashes of color to the scene. In the distance, the Rio Grande cut a silvery path across the land. "It's beautiful here," Rose said, her voice soft with genuine appreciation. Mason glanced at her, catching the way the late afternoon sun illuminated her profile. Despite her worn appearance, there was a loveliness to her that couldn't be diminished by circumstance. Her features were delicate, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Her eyes, he noticed now, were a clear, deep blue that reminded him of the summer sky. "It is," he agreed, turning his attention back to the road. "My father staked his claim here nearly 30 years ago, right after Texas joined the Union. Built the ranch from nothing." "You grew up here then?" Mason nodded. "Born and raised, except for the 5 years I was away." "Away?" Mason's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "The war. I enlisted in 61. Rose studied him. "You fought for the Confederacy?" "Yes, madam," he said, his voice neutral. The war had ended 8 years ago, but its shadow still stretched long across the land. Though I can't say I was fighting for any great cause. Mostly I was a young fool who thought there was glory to be found in battle." He shook his head. "There wasn't." Rose was quiet for a moment. Thomas wanted to enlist, but his father had died, and he was the only one left to care for his mother. She passed just before we married, 3 years ago. Mason felt a rush of sympathy for this young woman who had endured so much loss in such a short time. "I'm sorry." "Life happens as it will," Rose said, a thread of quiet strength in her voice. "We can only go forward." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds. As they crested a hill, Mason pointed ahead. "There it is, the Blackett Ranch." Rose leaned forward slightly, taking in the sight before her. The ranch house was substantial, a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. Several outbuildings stood nearby, a barn, stables, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and what looked like a workshop. Corrals held horses, and in the distance cattle grazed on the rolling pasture land. A small creek ran near the house, lined with cottonwoods and willows. "It's much larger than I expected," Rose said, unable to hide her surprise. Mason smiled slightly. "My father had big dreams, and my mother wouldn't settle for anything less than a proper home. She was from Boston originally, came out west as a school teacher and caught my father's eye." His voice held a hint of pride and nostalgia. "She's the one who insisted on the second story and the glass windows. Said just because we were on the frontier didn't mean we had to live like savages." Rose smiled at that. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Mason said. "She passed 10 years ago. Influenza. And your father?" "Last year. His heart." Mason sighed. "That's why I said the ranch needs a family. It's too quiet now with just me and the hands. Even Mrs. Finch only comes in during the day, goes back to her daughter's place in town at night." Rose nodded her understanding, and Mason realized he'd shared more about himself in this short journey than he typically did in months. There was something about Rose that made it easy to talk to her, perhaps her attentive listening, or the lack of judgment in her eyes. As they approached the ranch, a woman emerged from the house onto the porch. Mrs. Finch was in her 60s, a sturdy woman with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a tight bun. She shaded her eyes with one hand as she watched them approach. "That's Mrs. Finch," Mason explained. "She's been keeping house here since before I was born. Makes the best flapjacks you've ever tasted." Rose smoothed her skirt nervously. "Do you think she'll mind my being here?" Mason guided the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "She's been telling me for years that this house was meant for a family. I expect she'll be pleased to have another woman around." As if to prove his point, Mrs. Finch's face broke into a wide smile when she saw Rose. She hurried down the porch steps as Mason helped Rose down from the wagon. "Well now, who do we have here?" Mrs. Finch asked, her eyes taking in Rose's condition with interest rather than judgment. "Mrs. Finch, this is Mrs. Rose Dawson," Mason said formally. "She needed a place to stay, so I offered her our hospitality until she can continue her journey." Mrs. Finch's sharp eyes missed nothing. She noted Rose's worn dress, the small valise, and the protective way her hand rested on her belly. But instead of the disapproval Rose had clearly come to expect, Mrs. Finch's expression softened. "You poor dear. You look about ready to drop that baby any minute. Come inside and sit down before you fall down." She took Rose's arm gently. "Mason, bring in her things and then see to the horses. I'll get Mrs. Dawson settled." Mason watched as Mrs. Finch led Rose into the house, already chattering about getting her a cup of tea and something to eat. He smiled to himself, knowing Rose was in good hands. As he unhitched the horses and led them to the stable, Mason found himself thinking about the strange turn the day had taken. He'd gone into town for supplies and returned with a pregnant widow. What would his father have thought? Probably that Mason had finally lost his mind. But as he worked, Mason couldn't help but think that Rose's presence might be exactly what the ranch needed. What he needed, if he was being honest with himself. The house had been too empty, too quiet since his father died, haunted by memories and regrets. Rose Dawson might only be passing through, but for now, her presence brought a spark of life back to the Blackett Ranch. And Mason found he wasn't in any hurry to see that spark extinguished. Inside the house, Mrs. Finch had settled Rose at the large oak table in the kitchen and was bustling around, putting the kettle on for tea and slicing bread and cheese. "You just sit there and catch your breath," she instructed. "That's quite a journey in your condition, even if it's only from town." Rose accepted the cup of tea gratefully. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Finch. I don't want to be a burden." The housekeeper waved away her concern. "Nonsense. This house was built for a family, not for a solitary man to rattle around in. It does my heart good to see a woman at this table again." She placed a plate of bread, cheese, and preserves in front of Rose. "Now eat something. You're eating for two, remember?" Rose smiled and took a bite of the bread. It was fresh and delicious, clearly homemade. "This is wonderful," Mrs. Finch nodded approvingly. "Made it this morning. Mason has a proper mill on the property, his father's idea. We grind our own wheat." She sat down across from Rose. "Now, tell me about yourself. Mason said you're headed to San Antonio?" Rose explained her situation, while Mrs. Finch listened attentively, clucking sympathetically at appropriate moments. By the time Mason returned from the stables, the two women were chatting like old friends. "I see you've made yourselves acquainted," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Indeed we have," Mrs. Finch replied. "And I've decided Mrs. Dawson will take the blue room upstairs. It gets the morning sun, which will be nice for the baby when it comes." Mason raised an eyebrow. "The blue room? That's Mother's sewing room." "Was her sewing room, Mrs." Finch corrected him. "And it's been gathering dust for 10 years. Your mother would be the first to say it should be put to good use." She turned to Rose. "It's a lovely room, with a comfortable daybed that will serve until we can arrange something more suitable. There's even a small adjoining room that would make a perfect nursery." Rose looked between them uncertainly. "I don't want to displace any memories. Perhaps there's somewhere else." "Nonsense," Mrs. Finch said firmly. "It's the most suitable room in the house for a woman in your condition. Close to the necessary facilities and away from the noise of the ranch in the morning." Mason nodded his agreement. "Mrs. Finch is right. My mother would want you to use it." He smiled at Rose reassuringly. "Why don't I show you upstairs so you can rest before dinner? You must be tired." Rose did look exhausted, the events of the day clearly taking their toll. She nodded gratefully. "That would be wonderful, thank you." Mason led her through the main part of the house, a spacious living area with comfortable furniture arranged around a large stone fireplace, a formal dining room that looked rarely used, and a small study filled with books. The house was well built and solid, with polished wooden floors covered by colorful rugs that Rose suspected had been chosen by Mason's mother. They climbed the stairs slowly, Mason matching his pace to Rose's. At the top was a wide hallway with several doors leading off it. "That's my room at the end," Mason explained, pointing. "My father's room is across from it. That is, it's still as he left it." He seemed slightly embarrassed by this admission. "The blue room is here." He opened a door to reveal a charming room, painted a soft blue, just as Mrs. Finch had described. A daybed with a thick mattress was positioned near the window, which overlooked the garden at the back of the house. A small desk stood against one wall, and a wardrobe against another. A doorway led to a smaller room that, as Mrs. Finch had suggested, would indeed make a perfect nursery. Rose stepped into the room, running her hand over the patchwork quilt on the bed. "It's lovely." "My mother loved this room," Mason said, watching her. "She used to sit by that window and sew, watching over me and my brother playing in the garden below." Rose looked at him with interest. "You have a brother?" A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Had. Michael died in the war. Gettysburg." Rose's hand instinctively reached out to touch his arm in sympathy. "I'm so sorry." Mason nodded, his expression somber. "It's been 10 years, but some days it feels like yesterday." He seemed to shake himself out of the memory. "Well, I'll let you rest. Bathroom's at the end of the hall, opposite my room. We have indoor plumbing, another of my mother's insistences." Rose's eyes widened slightly. "Indoor plumbing? That's quite a luxury out here." Mason smiled, clearly proud of his home. "Like I said, my mother had standards. My father ran pipes from the spring on the property. We even have hot water when the kitchen stove is lit." He moved toward the door. "I'll have your valise brought up. Dinner's usually at 6, but if you're still resting, Mrs. Finch can bring a tray up." "Thank you, Mason," Rose said softly. "For everything. Not many would have done what you did today." Mason paused in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers. "Get some rest, Rose. You're safe here." As he closed the door behind him, Rose sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. This morning, she had been desperate, alone, and afraid. Now she was in a beautiful home, shown kindness by strangers who asked for nothing in return. For the first time in months, Rose felt something like hope stirring in her heart. She lay back on the bed, one hand resting on her swollen belly, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, the tension and fear of the past few months temporarily eased by the security of the Blackett Ranch. Rose slept deeply, only waking when a gentle knock sounded at her door. Disoriented for a moment, she sat up quickly, her hand automatically going to her belly as the baby shifted within her. "Mrs. Dawson, it's Mrs. Finch. May I come in?" "Yes, please," Rose called, swinging her legs over the side of the bed and smoothing her rumpled dress. "Mrs. Finch entered, carrying Rose's small valise. "I thought you might like to freshen up before dinner. I've brought some hot water for the basin." She set down the valise and moved to a washstand Rose hadn't noticed earlier, pouring steaming water into a porcelain bowl. "There's a clean towel there, and I've taken the liberty of putting out some soap." "Thank you," Rose said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. "What time is it?" "Just after 5. Dinner's at 6, but there's no rush if you're still tired." Mrs. Finch paused, studying Rose with a critical eye. "That dress has seen better days, dear." Rose flushed, embarrassed. "Yes, I had to sell most of my things. This is all I have left." Mrs. Finch nodded, unsurprised. "I thought as much. I've brought something that might help." She left the room briefly and returned with a bundle of fabric. "These were Mrs. Blackett's. She was about your size before you were expecting. I've kept her things carefully, couldn't bear to see them go to waste, and Mason wouldn't hear of selling them." She unfolded a simple but well-made dress of soft green cotton. "This one has a generous cut that might accommodate your condition, at least for now. And here's a shawl for the evenings." She held up a lovely crocheted shawl in cream-colored wool. Rose's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Finch interrupted firmly. "They're just gathering dust in trunks. Elizabeth Blackett was a practical woman. She'd be pleased to know her things were being put to good use." Rose hesitated, then reached out to touch the dress. The fabric was of much better quality than her worn calico. "If you're sure—" "I am. Now, I'll leave you to wash up and change. The privy, excuse me, the water closet is down the hall if you need it." Another of Mrs. Blackett's insistences. Mrs. Finch smiled. She was a fine woman with refined tastes, but not a bit stuck up for all that. You'd have liked her. After Mrs. Finch left, Rose washed her face and hands in the warm water, then opened her valise. It contained her nightgown, a spare set of undergarments, a hairbrush, a small Bible that had belonged to Thomas's mother, and a daguerreotype of Thomas taken shortly after their wedding. She gazed at his image for a moment, his serious expression, the slight smile that had always seemed to hover just beneath the surface. What would he think of her situation now? "I'm doing the best I can, Thomas," she whispered, touching the image gently before returning it to the valise. Rose changed into the green dress, grateful to find it did indeed accommodate her swollen belly, though it was a bit short, revealing her ankles. She brushed her honey-brown hair, which fell in waves to the middle of her back, and debated whether to put it up again. Deciding she lacked the energy, she left it loose but tidy. The shawl Mrs. Finch had provided was soft and warm, and Rose wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully. The spring evenings could still be chilly, especially after sundown. When she made her way downstairs, guided by the tantalizing aromas emanating from the kitchen, she found Mason setting the table in the dining room. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, he simply stared. "You look rested," he finally said, though his expression suggested he'd been thinking something else entirely. Rose touched her hair self-consciously. "Mrs. Finch lent me this dress. I hope that's all right." "Of course," Mason said quickly. "My mother's things should be used, not hidden away. She would have wanted that." His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he returned to his task. "Can I help?" Rose asked, moving closer to the table. "No need. Almost done." Mason placed the last fork and stepped back. "We don't usually use the dining room too formal for just me, but Mrs. Finch insisted tonight." Rose smiled. "She's been very kind." "She has a good heart," Mason agreed, "and she's probably thrilled to have a reason to use the good china." As if on cue, Mrs. Finch emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming tureen. "Sit down, both of you. The biscuits will be ready in a moment." Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Mrs. Finch had prepared a hearty beef stew with fresh biscuits and a side of early spring greens from her garden. The conversation flowed easily as Mason told Rose more about the ranch, the cattle operation, the small crops they grew mostly for their own use, the horses he bred and trained. "The ranch is almost self-sufficient," he explained. "My father believed in being able to provide for ourselves as much as possible. We grow our own wheat and corn, keep chickens for eggs and meat, have a milk cow, and, of course, the beef cattle for market." "It sounds wonderful," Rose said sincerely. "Thomas and I dreamed of having a place of our own someday, though nothing as grand as this." "It's not so grand," Mason said modestly. "Just the result of 30 years of hard work." "Mrs. Finch snorted. "Don't let him fool you, Mrs. Dawson. The Blackett Ranch is one of the most prosperous in the county. Mason has a head for business, just like his father." Mason looked slightly embarrassed. "Mrs. Finch exaggerates." "I do not," the housekeeper replied firmly. "You've doubled the herd since taking over, and that new breeding program with the horses is already showing promise." Rose looked at Mason with new interest. "You breed horses?" Mason nodded, seeming more comfortable discussing his work than receiving compliments. "Quarter horses, mainly. Good cow ponies with speed and endurance. I've been experimenting with crossing them with thoroughbreds for a bit more height and refinement without losing the cow sense." "Mason has a way with horses," Mrs. Finch added. "Always has, even as a boy. They trust him." As they ate dessert, a delicious apple cobbler with fresh cream, Rose found herself relaxing more than she had in months. The warm, comfortable house, the good food, and the easy companionship made her feel, for the first time since Thomas's death, that perhaps everything might turn out all right after all. After dinner, Mason excused himself to check on some new calves, and Mrs. Finch shooed Rose into the living room while she cleaned up. "I'll just be heading home after the dishes are done," she explained. "My daughter expects me, but I'll be back in the morning to fix breakfast." Rose settled into a comfortable armchair by the fireplace, where a small fire took the chill off the spring evening. She found herself looking around the room with interest, noting the bookshelves filled with volumes, the framed photographs on the mantel, the quality furniture that showed signs of age but had been well maintained. This was clearly a home that had been built with love and care, a place where a family had lived and grown. Rose felt a pang of envy, quickly followed by guilt. She had no right to envy Mason his home, especially when he had so generously opened it to her. She rose and moved to the mantel, studying the photographs displayed there. One showed a handsome couple on their wedding day, the man tall and broad-shouldered with a serious expression, the woman petite and refined, looking with intelligent eyes. Mason's parents, she assumed. Another showed two young boys sitting on horses, grinning at the camera. Mason and his brother, no doubt. There were several more family photographs, tracking the boys' growth into young men. The most recent appeared to be of Mason in his Confederate uniform, standing straight and proud, looking impossibly young and solemn. Next to it was a similar photograph of a young man who strongly resembled Mason Michael, she presumed, also in uniform. "That was taken just before we left for the war," Mason's voice came from behind her, making her start slightly. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you." "No, I'm sorry," Rose said quickly. "I shouldn't have been prying." "You weren't prying," Mason assured her, coming to stand beside her at the mantel. "They're meant to be seen." He picked up the photograph of himself in uniform. I was 20, thought I knew everything, found out quickly how wrong I was. Rose studied his face, noting how different the Mason before her was from the young man in the photograph. The lines around his eyes and mouth spoke of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. "And this is Michael?" she asked gently, indicating the other photograph. Mason nodded, his expression softening. Yes, he was 18, too young really, but wild to go. I couldn't talk him out of it. He set down his own photograph and picked up Michael's, his thumb brushing over the glass. He was always the better of us, kinder, more thoughtful. He should have been the one to come home. The raw pain in his voice touched Rose deeply. "I'm sure he wouldn't have thought so," she said softly. Mason carefully replaced the photograph on the mantel. "No, probably not. He was generous that way." He seemed to shake off the melancholy. "Mrs. Finch has gone home for the night. Can I get you anything before I turn in? Tea? Another blanket for your room?" Rose shook her head. "No, thank you. I have everything I need." She hesitated, then added, "Mason, I want you to know how grateful I am. You've been more than kind to a stranger." Mason looked at her for a long moment. "You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Rose, and kindness costs nothing. Still, not everyone would have done what you did. I won't forget it." Mason shifted slightly, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing anyone decent wouldn't have done. Anyway, you should get some rest. First day in a new place is always tiring." Rose nodded, recognizing his desire to change the subject. "You're right. Good night, Mason." "Good night, Rose. Sleep well." As Rose climbed the stairs to her room, she felt Mason's eyes on her back, watching to make sure she made it safely. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, rather. It gave her a feeling of security she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. In her room, Rose changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the covers of the daybed. The mattress was comfortable, the linens clean and fragrant with lavender. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the night sky, more than she had ever been able to see in Houston. As she drifted toward sleep, Rose found herself thinking about Mason Blackett, his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, the pain he still carried from the war. There was more to him than met the eye, she decided. And despite her intention to continue to San Antonio as soon as possible, Rose couldn't help but be curious about the man who had taken her into his home with no questions asked. With that thought lingering in her mind, Rose fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had experienced in months, cradled in the safety of the Blackett Ranch. The next morning, Rose woke to sunlight streaming through the east-facing window. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she remembered where she was, the Blackett Ranch, in the blue room that had once belonged to Mason's mother. The baby was active this morning, kicking and shifting inside her. Rose placed her hand on her belly, smiling despite herself. "Good morning to you too, little one," she murmured. She rose and dressed in the green dress Mrs. Finch had loaned her, grateful again for its comfortable fit. After washing her face and braiding her hair, she made her way downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and bacon. The kitchen was warm and inviting, with sunlight pouring through the windows. Mrs. Finch stood at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet, while Mason sat at the table, a cup of coffee in front of him and a ledger open beside it. He looked up as Rose entered, his expression brightening. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Rose admitted, taking a seat at the table. "The room is very comfortable." Mrs. Finch placed a cup of tea in front of Rose without being asked. "No coffee for you in your condition, dear. Herb tea is better for the baby." Rose smiled her thanks, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "It smells wonderful." "Special blend," Mrs. Finch said proudly. "Good for settling the stomach and strengthening the blood. My grandmother was a midwife, taught me a few things about caring for expectant mothers." Mason closed his ledger and took a sip of his coffee. "I need to ride out with the men this morning. One of the hands spotted a break in the fence line on the north pasture yesterday evening." Mrs. Finch nodded absently, transferring bacon to a plate. "You'll be back for dinner?" "Should be," Mason replied. He glanced at Rose. "Will you be all right here? Mrs. Finch can show you around if you're feeling up to it." "I'd like that," Rose said. "I've never been on a ranch before. It would be interesting to see how everything works." Mason smiled. "Not much to see this time of year. The real work happens during roundup and branding. Still, I'd love to look around. If it's no trouble, Rose added quickly. No trouble at all, Mrs. Finch assured her, setting plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits on the table. We'll go at your pace. You need to be careful in your condition. After breakfast, Mason left for his work, and Mrs. Finch insisted Rose rest a while before their tour. Digestion is important, she said firmly. Sit and relax for a bit, then I'll show you the place. Rose didn't argue, happy to sit at the kitchen table with another cup of tea while Mrs. Finch bustled about, starting bread dough for the day's baking. Have you been with the Blackett family long? Rose asked, watching the older woman's capable hands kneading the dough. Since before Mason was born, Mrs. Finch replied. I came out west with my husband in '42. He worked for Mr. Blackett, helped build this very house. A shadow crossed her face. He died in '49, during a raid. Comanches. I'm so sorry, Rose said softly. Mrs. Finch shrugged. It was a long time ago. The frontier was dangerous in those days. Still can be, but things have settled down some. She covered the dough with a cloth and set it aside to rise. The Blacketts were good to me after Walter died, kept me on, gave me a place to belong. They became my family. She wiped her hands on her apron. Elizabeth Blackett Mason's mother, she was a fine woman, cultured, educated, but not afraid to get her hands dirty. She taught the local children to read and write before there was a proper school in Brownsville. Taught me, too. Rose smiled. She sounds wonderful. She was, and strong, had to be, to make a life out here. She and George, that was Mr. Blackett, they built something special here, not just the ranch, but a home. Mrs. Finch sighed. It's been too quiet since they've been gone. Mason keeps to himself too much. Rose wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply sipped her tea. Well, Mrs. Finch said briskly, changing the subject. If you're rested, I can show you around now. We'll go slowly, mind you. The tour began with the house itself, the formal dining room they had used the night before, the study filled with books. Mr. Blackett believed in education, Mrs. Finch explained. The small music room with a piano that had been shipped all the way from Boston. Mrs. Blackett played beautifully. And a sunny sewing room downstairs that had been converted from a bedroom. Outside, Mrs. Finch showed Rose the kitchen garden, already sprouting early vegetables, and the flower beds that would bloom later in the spring. Mrs. Blackett loved her roses, the housekeeper explained. Mason keeps them up, though he'd never admit to having a soft spot for flowers. They walked slowly past the stables, where a few horses watched them curiously from their stalls. That's Thunderbolt, Mrs. Finch said, pointing to a magnificent black stallion. Mason's pride and joy, sire for his breeding program. Beyond the stables was the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, the workshop where tools were repaired and horseshoes forged, and various other outbuildings serving the needs of the ranch. It's larger than I expected, Rose admitted as they made their way back to the house. How many men work here? 8 full-time hands, Mrs. Finch replied. More during roundup and branding. Mason treats them well, pays fair wages. They're loyal to him. By the time they returned to the house, Rose was tired but pleased with what she'd seen. The Blackett Ranch was impressive not just in size, but in how well organized and maintained it was. It spoke of careful planning and hard work spanning decades. You should rest now, Mrs. Finch insisted, guiding Rose to a comfortable chair in the living room. I'll bring you some lemonade. Rose didn't argue, grateful to take the weight off her feet. As she sat looking out at the ranch, she couldn't help but compare it to the modest life she'd led with Thomas in Houston. They had been happy in their small rented house, but Thomas had always dreamed of having land of his own someday, a place to build a future for their family. Now that dream would never be realized. Thomas was gone, and Rose was left to make her way alone, with a child to care for. The thought brought tears to her eyes, which she hastily wiped away as Mrs. Finch returned with the lemonade. The housekeeper noticed, but didn't comment, simply handing Rose the glass and patting her shoulder gently before returning to her duties. Rose spent the afternoon resting, reading a book she'd found in the study, a collection of poetry by Tennyson. She was surprised by how comfortable she felt in the Blackett home, as if she'd been there much longer than just one day. She was even more surprised to realize that she was in no hurry to leave for San Antonio. The thought of continuing her journey, of starting over yet again in another unfamiliar place, suddenly seemed daunting. Here at the ranch, she felt safe, cared for, but she knew she couldn't impose on Mason's hospitality indefinitely. Eventually, she would need to move on to find a way to support herself and her child. When Mason returned in the late afternoon, he found Rose still in the living room, the book open on her lap. He paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her, illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the window. "Tennyson?" he asked, gesturing to the book as he entered the room. Rose nodded, marking her place with a ribbon. "Yes, I hope you don't mind. I found it in the study." "Not at all. The books are there to be read." Mason sat in the chair opposite her. "My mother was fond of poetry. She used to read to us in the evenings." "It's a beautiful collection," Rose said. "I particularly enjoyed Ulysses." Mason smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually serious face. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. "One of my favorites, too." Rose was momentarily startled by the change in his appearance when he smiled. His face, already handsome in a rugged way, became almost boyish, years dropping away to reveal the young man he must have been before the war. "Did you enjoy your tour of the ranch?" he asked, seeming unaware of the effect his smile had on her. Rose nodded, gathering her thoughts. "Very much. It's a wonderful place. You should be proud of what your family has built here." "I am," Mason said simply, "though I can't take much credit for it. My father did the hard part, starting from nothing." "Mrs. Finch says you've expanded since taking over," Rose pointed out. Mason shrugged modestly. "Just continuing what he began. I've been lucky good years, fair weather, strong cattle prices." He paused, then added, "I'm glad you're feeling well enough to explore. Mrs. Finch said you did well today." "She's been very kind," Rose said. "Everyone has been." She hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about my plans." Mason leaned forward slightly, his expression attentive. "Oh? I still intend to go to San Antonio, to my cousin," Rose clarified quickly. "But I'm wondering if perhaps I should wait until after the baby comes. Traveling in my condition is difficult, and it would be harder with a newborn." She watched Mason's face carefully as she spoke, trying to gauge his reaction. Would he think she was taking advantage of his hospitality? But Mason's expression remained open and thoughtful. "That seems sensible. The journey to San Antonio isn't easy even for someone in perfect health." He paused. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to, Rose. There's plenty of room here, and Mrs. Finch would be beside herself with joy to have a baby in the house again." Relief washed over Rose. "Thank you, Mason. I promise I won't impose any longer than necessary. Once the baby comes and we're strong enough to travel, we'll continue to San Antonio." Mason nodded, though Rose thought she detected a flicker of something like disappointment in his eyes. "Of course. In the meantime, consider the Blackett Ranch your home." The word home struck Rose deeply. She hadn't had a true home since Thomas died, since she'd been forced to sell their belongings and give up their small house in Houston. The idea that this beautiful ranch could be her home, even temporarily, filled her with a warmth she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft with emotion. Mason seemed about to say something more when Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway, announcing that dinner was ready. The moment passed, but as they walked to the dining room together, Rose was acutely aware of Mason's presence beside her, solid and reassuring. For the first time since Thomas's death, Rose felt like she might have found a safe harbor in the storm of her life. It wasn't permanent, she knew that, but for now, it was enough. The days at the Blackett Ranch fell into a pleasant routine. Rose would wake with the sun, dress in one of the maternity dresses Mrs. Finch had altered from Elizabeth Blackett's clothes, and join Mason and the housekeeper for breakfast. Mason would then head out to work with his men, while Rose helped Mrs. Finch with light chores around the house. Despite Mrs. Finch's protests that she should rest in her condition, Rose insisted on contributing in some way. "I need to keep active," she explained, "and I want to earn my keep." So, Mrs. Finch allowed her to help with the mending, to shell peas from the garden, and to dust the bookshelves in the study. Rose found these simple domestic tasks soothing, a connection to the normal life she had lost when Thomas died. In the afternoons, she often read in the living room, or, when the weather was fine, on the porch. Sometimes Mason would join her for tea when he returned from his work, and they would talk about books, about the ranch, about anything except the war and the losses they had both endured. Rose learned that Mason had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, that he was well-read despite his frontier upbringing, and that he had a deep love for the land that went beyond mere ownership. "It gets in your blood," he explained one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "The rhythm of the seasons, the cycle of birth and growth. There's a rightness to it that I never found anywhere else." Rose understood what he meant. Even in the short time she'd been at the ranch, she had come to appreciate its beauty and vitality. There was something healing about watching new calves wobble to their feet, about seeing seeds push through the soil in the garden, about the constant movement and life all around her. As April turned to May, Rose's pregnancy advanced, her body growing heavier and more unwieldy. The baby was active, especially at night, kicking and shifting as if impatient to enter the world. One warm evening, she and Mason sat on the porch after dinner, enjoying the cool breeze. Rose winced as the baby delivered a particularly forceful kick. "Are you all right?" Mason asked, his voice concerned. "Yes," Rose assured him. "Just an active little one." Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it on her belly. "Feel." Mason's eyes widened as the baby kicked against his palm. For a moment, he seemed frozen, his expression a mixture of awe and something Rose couldn't quite identify. "That's remarkable," he said softly, his hand lingering on her belly. Their eyes met, and Rose felt a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the spring evening. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch. Mason withdrew his hand and stood, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "It's Ramirez," he said, identifying one of his ranch hands. "Something must be wrong for him to ride in this late." The young Mexican vaquero reined his horse to a stop in front of the porch. "Senor Blackett," he called, his voice urgent. "There is trouble at the north fence. Cattle rustlers. Rodriguez and I saw them. They have taken at least a dozen head." Mason's expression hardened. "How many men?" "4, maybe 5. They headed north toward the border." Mason turned to Rose. "I need to go. Stay in the house. Tell Mrs. Finch what's happening. She'll know what to do." Before Rose could respond, Mason was striding toward the stables, calling for his horse to be saddled. Ramirez followed, relaying more details about what they had seen. Rose watched them go, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She had heard stories of cattle rustlers, how desperate and dangerous they could be. The thought of Mason facing such men filled her with dread. She went inside to find Mrs. Finch, who took the news with grim practicality. "It happens sometimes," the housekeeper said, though her worried expression belied her calm tone. "Mason knows how to handle himself." But as the evening wore on, with no sign of Mason's return, both women grew increasingly concerned. They sat in the kitchen, Mrs. Finch knitting furiously while Rose tried to focus on her mending, each listening for the sound of horses approaching. Finally, well after midnight, they heard hoofbeats in the yard. Rose was on her feet immediately, moving to the window. In the moonlight, she could see Mason and his men returning, leading several cattle back toward the pasture. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her knees weak. She sank back into her chair as Mrs. Finch went to the door. "Thank the Lord," the older woman murmured, peering out into the night. "They're back, and looks like they recovered the cattle, too." It was another half hour before Mason came into the house. He looked tired, with dust covering his clothes and a long scratch on one cheek, but otherwise unharmed. "You're both still up," he said, sounding surprised as he entered the kitchen. "Of course we are," Mrs. Finch said briskly, already moving to pour him a cup of coffee. "We were worried." Mason accepted the coffee gratefully. "No need. We caught up with them before they reached the border. They abandoned the cattle and ran when they realized they were outnumbered." "You're hurt," Rose said, gesturing to the scratch on his cheek. Mason touched it absently. "Just a branch. We had to ride through some thick brush to catch up to them." Without thinking, Rose dipped a clean cloth in water and approached him, gently cleaning the scratch. Mason went very still under her ministrations, his eyes fixed on her face. "It's not deep," she said softly. "It should heal quickly." "Thank you," Mason replied, his voice equally soft. Mrs. Finch, watching this exchange with interest, suddenly announced that she was too tired to stay any longer and would head home for the night. "Don't forget to lock up," she admonished as she left. Alone in the kitchen, Rose and Mason looked at each other, the air between them charged with an awareness neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "You should get some rest," Mason finally said, breaking the silence. "It's late, And in your condition? Rose nodded, stepping back. Yes, you're right. I'm glad you're safe, Mason. I'm sorry if we worried you, he said. Cattle rustling is just part of ranching life out here. Usually not dangerous, just annoying. Rose managed a small smile. Still, I'm glad you're back safely. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Rose found herself reflecting on the intensity of her relief when she had seen Mason return unharmed. It had been disproportionate to the actual danger he had faced, revealing feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to examine too closely. Thomas had been gone less than 6 months. It seemed disloyal somehow to be developing feelings for another man so soon. And yet, there was no denying the warmth that spread through her whenever Mason smiled at her, the comfort she found in his presence, the way her heart had raced when he placed his hand on her belly to feel the baby kick. In the privacy of her room, Rose admitted to herself what she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She was falling in love with Mason Blackett. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. What would happen when it was time for her to leave for San Antonio? And more importantly, did Mason feel anything similar for her, or was his kindness simply the natural response of a decent man to someone in need? With these questions circling in her mind, Rose finally fell into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with images of Mason riding away into danger, of herself calling after him but unable to make him hear. The next morning, Rose woke feeling tired and out of sorts. Her back ached, and the baby seemed to be pressing uncomfortably low in her belly. When she made her way downstairs, moving more slowly than usual, Mason took one look at her and insisted she sit down. "You look exhausted," he said, concern evident in his voice. "You shouldn't have stayed up so late waiting for us." "I'm fine," Rose assured him, though she gratefully accepted the chair he pulled out for her. "Just a bit of backache. Normal at this stage, I think." Mrs. Finch, arriving just then with a basket of fresh eggs, took one look at Rose and declared that she would be resting today. No arguments. "You're carrying low," the housekeeper observed, setting down her basket. "Baby might be coming sooner than we thought." Rose looked alarmed. "But I've still got at least 3 weeks by my calculations." Mrs. Finch shrugged. "Babies come when they're ready, not according to our schedules. Best to be prepared." She turned to Mason. "You should ride into town and fetch Dr. Harmon, just to be safe." Mason nodded immediately. "I'll go after breakfast." Despite Rose's protests that there was no need to trouble the doctor yet, Mason rode into Brownsville as soon as he had finished eating. Rose, relegated to a comfortable chair in the living room with strict instructions from Mrs. Finch to rest, found herself touched by their concern. Thomas had been attentive during her pregnancy, but often preoccupied with his work. Here at the ranch, she found herself surrounded by care that went beyond mere politeness. Mrs. Finch treated her almost like a daughter, and Mason, well, Mason's attention felt like something more than neighborly concern, though Rose was still afraid to hope too much. By mid-afternoon, Mason returned with Dr. Harmon, a grandfatherly man with kind eyes and a reassuring manner. After examining Rose in the privacy of her room, he announced that while labor wasn't imminent, the baby had indeed dropped into position for birth. "It could be days or even a couple of weeks yet," he told Rose. "But given your isolation out here, it's good to be cautious. First babies are often slow to arrive, but not always." He left instructions with Mrs. Finch about signs to watch for and promised to return in a week unless sent for earlier. When he came downstairs, he found Mason pacing in the living room, his face tight with concern. "She's fine," the doctor assured him. "Healthy young woman, normal pregnancy. Nothing to worry about yet." Mason nodded, his relief visible. "Thank you for coming, Doc. I know it's a long ride from town." "Part of the job," Dr. Harmon said easily. He studied Mason for a moment, then added, "She's a lovely young woman, Mason. Reminds me a bit of your mother, same quiet strength." Mason looked startled by the comparison. "I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. There is a similarity." The doctor patted his shoulder. "Your mother would approve, I think." With that cryptic comment, he took his leave, declining Mason's offer to ride part of the way back with him. In the days that followed, Rose found herself the center of attention at the ranch. Mrs. Finch hovered constantly, bringing her special teas and making sure she rested frequently. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her and asked after her health with genuine concern. And Mason Mason seemed unable to stay away for long, finding reasons to return to the house throughout the day to check on her. One afternoon, about a week after the doctor's visit, Rose sat on the porch enjoying the late May sunshine. The weather was warm, but not yet hot, perfect for sitting outside. She was working on a small baby gown, using fabric Mrs. Finch had found in Elizabeth Blackett's sewing supplies. Mason came up from the stables, pausing at the bottom of the porch steps to remove his hat. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not," Rose said, setting aside her sewing. "It's your porch, after all." Mason smiled as he settled into the chair beside her. "It feels more like yours these days. The whole house does somehow." Rose felt her cheeks warm at his words. "I've tried to make myself useful." "It's not about being useful," Mason said thoughtfully. "It's about belonging. You fit here, Rose, as if the house was waiting for you." The simple statement touched her deeply. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "I've felt at home here in a way I didn't expect." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the activities of the ranchmen moving cattle in the distance, chickens pecking in the yard, a rider returning from checking the fence line. "I received a letter from San Antonio today," Mason said eventually. "From your cousin." Rose's head turned sharply toward him. "Rebecca wrote to you? How did she know where I am?" "She didn't," Mason explained. "You mentioned you hadn't heard from her after writing about your plans to join them. I thought perhaps your letter had gone astray, so I took the liberty of writing to her last week, explaining your situation." Rose stared at him, speechless for a moment. "You wrote to Rebecca," she finally managed. "What did she say?" Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded letter, which he handed to Rose. "See for yourself." With trembling fingers, Rose unfolded the letter. It was addressed to Mason, written in Rebecca's familiar flowing script. As she read, her expression shifted from anticipation to dismay. "They've moved to California," she said, her voice hollow. "Rebecca's husband sold the hotel and took a position managing one in San Francisco. They left 3 weeks ago." She looked up at Mason, her eyes wide with shock. "If I had arrived in San Antonio as planned, they would have already been gone." Mason nodded solemnly. "That's what I gathered. They had no way to reach you since you were traveling." Rose continued reading. "She says they would have welcomed me, but the journey to California would be too difficult in my condition. She suggests I consider your offer to stay at the ranch for now." Her voice trailed off as she reached the end of the letter. "She says she'll write again once they're settled, with their address in San Francisco." Rose lowered the letter to her lap, her mind racing. The plan she had clung to for months, the future she had imagined for herself and her child, had disappeared in an instant. She had no home, no means of support, and now no family to turn to. "What will I do now?" she whispered, more to herself than to Mason. "Stay here," Mason said immediately, his voice firm. "Stay at the ranch." Rose looked at him, surprise mingling with gratitude. "Mason, I can't impose on you indefinitely. You've already done so much." "It's not an imposition," Mason interrupted. "Rose, He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "The ranch has been a lonely place since my parents died, since Michael. It was just a place to work, not a home. But since you've been here, it feels alive again." He reached out hesitantly, taking her hand in his. "I know it's sudden. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I respect that. I'm not asking for any promises. Just stay. At least until you decide what you want to do next." Rose looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. "Are you sure? A woman with another man's child?" "I don't care about that," Mason said firmly. "The baby is part of you, and that's enough for me." He squeezed her hand gently. "Besides, my ranch needs a family. It was built for one." The simple honesty in his voice brought tears to Rose's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," Mason urged. "Not just until the baby comes, but after. Say you'll give us a chance to see if there could be something between us." Rose looked into his eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability there. This strong, capable man, who had faced war and loss, was laying his heart bare to her, offering her not just shelter, but the possibility of a new life, a new love. "I'll stay," she said softly. "I want to stay, Mason." The smile that lit his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Without thinking, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through Rose's entire body. When he pulled back, his expression was both joyful and slightly embarrassed. "I shouldn't have done that. Not yet. But I've been wanting to for weeks." Rose smiled, her tears now ones of happiness rather than distress. "I didn't mind." Their moment was interrupted by a sharp pain that made Rose gasp and clutch her belly. Mason's expression immediately turned to concern. "What is it? What's wrong?" Rose took a deep breath as the pain subsided. I think it might be time." Mason's eyes widened with alarm. "The baby? Now?" He leaped to his feet. "I'll get Mrs. Finch. Don't move." As he rushed into the house, calling for the housekeeper, Rose couldn't help but smile despite the returning pain. Her life had taken so many unexpected turns: the loss of Thomas, the journey to Brownsville, meeting Mason. Now, it seemed, another turn was coming, sooner than anticipated. The baby was coming, and with it, the beginning of a new chapter in her life. A chapter that, against all odds, would be written here at the Blackett Ranch, with Mason at her side. Mrs. Finch took charge immediately, confirming that Rose was indeed in labor. "These pains have probably been coming on gradually all day," she told Rose as she helped her to her room. "First babies often start slowly." Mason, looking pale and anxious, hovered in the hallway. "Should I ride for the doctor?" "Yes," Mrs. Finch said firmly. "But send one of the hands. You stay here. We might need you." Mason nodded, clearly relieved to have clear instructions. He disappeared down the stairs, and Rose could hear him calling for one of the ranch hands. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and waiting for Rose. Mrs. Finch stayed with her constantly, offering encouragement and practical help. Mason remained downstairs, occasionally calling up to ask how things were progressing, his voice tight with concern. "Men, Mrs." Finch muttered after one such inquiry. "Always thinking childbirth is some great emergency. Women have been doing this since Eve, and mostly without doctors hovering about." Despite her bravado, Rose was grateful for the older woman's experience and calm presence. As the labor progressed and the pains intensified, Mrs. Finch's steady voice and capable hands were a lifeline. "You're doing wonderfully," she assured Rose as another contraction gripped her. "Strong and brave, just like I knew you would be." By sunset, the pains were coming regularly and with increasing intensity. Dr. Harmon had not yet arrived. The ride to town and back would take hours, even at a gallop, and Rose began to fear he wouldn't make it in time. "Don't you worry about the doctor," Mrs. Finch said, seeming to read her thoughts. "My grandmother delivered hundreds of babies, and she taught me well. We can manage if need be." As twilight deepened into night, Rose's labor intensified. Mrs. Finch sent for Mason, who appeared in the doorway looking apprehensive. "Still no sign of the doctor?" Mrs. Finch asked. Mason shook his head. "No, but Williams should have reached town by now. They might be on their way back." Mrs. Finch nodded briskly. "Well, we can't wait. I need hot water and clean towels, and that bottle of whiskey from the study for medicinal purposes." Mason hurried to comply, clearly relieved to have something concrete to do. When he returned with the requested items, Mrs. Finch shooed him back to the hallway. "Wait there," she instructed. "I'll call if we need you." The next hour was the most challenging of Rose's life. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, wave after wave of it washing over her, demanding all her strength and will. She thought of Thomas, of the child they had created together, drawing courage from the memory of his love. And she thought of Mason, waiting anxiously just outside the door, offering a future she had never expected to find again. Finally, with one last tremendous effort, Rose felt the baby slide from her body, followed by a moment of breathless silence, before a lusty cry filled the room. "A boy!" Mrs. Finch announced triumphantly, her face shining with joy. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Tears of relief and joy streamed down Rose's face as Mrs. Finch placed the squalling infant on her chest. He was red-faced and angry at his abrupt entry into the world, his tiny fists flailing as he cried. "Oh," Rose breathed, touching his downy head with trembling fingers. "Hello, little one. I've been waiting for you." Mrs. Finch worked efficiently to deliver the afterbirth and make Rose comfortable, then wrapped the baby more securely and placed him back in his mother's arms. "I'll tell Mason," she said, her voice gentle. "Unless you'd rather wait?" Rose shook her head. "No, please ask him to come in. I want him to meet the baby." When Mason entered the room, his expression was a mixture of awe and trepidation. He moved to Rose's bedside slowly, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in her arms. "Rose," he said softly, "you're all right?" She nodded, smiling tiredly. "We both are. Would you like to meet him?" Mason sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the baby's face. The infant had calmed now, his eyes dark blue like most newborns blinking up at the new faces above him. "He's perfect," Mason said, his voice hushed with wonder. "What will you call him?" Rose had thought about names during her pregnancy, discussing options with Thomas before his death. They had settled on a name for a boy, one that Rose still felt was right. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Mason Dawson." Mason's head jerked up, his eyes meeting hers with surprise. "Mason?" Rose nodded. "If that's all right with you, to honor both his father and the man who gave us a home when we needed it most." Mason's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Mrs. Finch, who had been quietly working in the background, wiped her own eyes with the corner of her apron. "Well, now that that's settled, I think mother and baby need rest. And you too, Mason. It's been a long day for everyone." Mason nodded, rising reluctantly from the bed. "I'll be just down the hall if you need anything at all." Rose smiled up at him, exhausted but happier than she had believed possible just a few months ago. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." After Mason left, Mrs. Finch helped Rose nurse the baby for the first time, then settled them both for sleep. "I'll stay tonight," she said. "Sleep when he sleeps. That's my advice to new mothers." As Rose drifted towards sleep, baby Thomas nestled securely beside her. She felt a sense of peace and rightness that had been missing since her husband's death. Life had brought her to this place, to these people, through tragedy and hardship. And somehow, in the midst of loss, she had found the possibility of a new beginning. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Mason's face as he looked at her son, not with the reserve of a man viewing another man's child, but with the tender wonder of someone witnessing a miracle. Perhaps in time, he could come to love Thomas as his own, and perhaps Rose could allow herself to love again, to build a family here on this ranch that had opened its doors to her when she had nowhere else to go. Dr. Harmon arrived shortly before dawn, having ridden through the night once he received word that Rose was in labor. By that time, both mother and baby were sleeping peacefully, and Mrs. Finch was dozing in a chair nearby. The doctor examined them both and pronounced them in excellent health. "You did well, Mrs. Finch," he said approvingly. "Couldn't have done better myself." Mason, who had been pacing the living room most of the night, unable to sleep, looked relieved at the doctor's assessment. "They're really all right?" "Right as rain," Dr. Harmon assured him. "Mother's young and healthy. Baby's a good size and has strong lungs from what I hear. They'll do fine." He studied Mason's exhausted face. "You, on the other hand, look like you could use some rest." Mason shook his head. "Too much to do. The ranch doesn't run itself, and now, with Rose recovering and the baby..." Mrs. Finch, who had awakened at the doctor's arrival, snorted from the doorway. "The ranch can manage for one day while you get some sleep, Mason Blackett. The men know what to do, and as for Rose and the baby, that's what I'm here for." Dr. Harmon nodded his agreement. "Listen to Mrs. Finch, Mason. Best thing you can do for them right now is take care of yourself." Finally persuaded, Mason retreated to his room for a few hours of much-needed sleep. When he woke around noon, the house was quiet except for the sound of Mrs. Finch working in the kitchen. "They're still sleeping," she told him when he appeared, looking rumpled but more rested. "Baby woke for feeding about an hour ago. Then they both went back to sleep. Best thing for them." Mason nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Is there anything they need? Anything I can do?" Mrs. Finch smiled at his eagerness. "Not just now, but Rose will need to take it easy for a while. No heavy lifting, plenty of rest. The baby will keep her up at night, so she'll need to sleep when she can during the day." "Of course," Mason agreed immediately. "Whatever she needs." The housekeeper studied him with knowing eyes. "You care for her, don't you? More than just as someone in need." Mason didn't bother to deny it. "Yes. I know it's fast, and she's still grieving her husband, but yes." Mrs. Finch nodded, satisfied. Good. She needs someone steady, someone who'll be there for her and that baby. And you need someone to bring life back into this house. She pointed a finger at him. But you take it slow, you hear me? She's got enough to adjust to with the new baby. Don't rush her. I won't, Mason promised. I just want her to stay, to give us a chance to see if there could be something between us. She'll stay, Mrs. Finch said confidently. Where else would she go now? And besides, she added with a smile, I've seen the way she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. There's something there already. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment as Rose and baby Thomas settled into life at the ranch. True to Mrs. Finch's prediction, Rose found herself constantly tired, snatching sleep whenever the baby allowed it. But despite the exhaustion, she had never been happier. Mason proved to be an unexpected source of support. Though he had never been around infants before, he showed a natural affinity for Thomas, not hesitating to hold him or walk with him when he was fussy, allowing Rose precious moments to rest. You're good with him, Rose observed one evening as Mason paced the living room with Thomas cradled against his shoulder, the baby's eyes drooping with sleep. Mason smiled, looking down at the infant with obvious affection. He makes it easy. He's a good baby. Not at 3 a.m, Rose said ruefully. But yes, he is. As the weeks passed and Rose regained her strength, she began to take on more responsibilities around the house. She enjoyed cooking alongside Mrs. Finch, learning the older woman's recipes and techniques. She tended the garden, Thomas napping in a basket nearby, and even began to help with the ranch's bookkeeping, using skills she had developed helping Thomas with his carpentry business. Mason, watching her bloom in her new role, found himself falling more deeply in love with her each day. He tried to heed Mrs. Finch's advice about taking things slowly, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide his feelings. One evening in late June, about a month after Thomas's birth, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The baby was asleep inside, and the evening was peaceful, with only the sounds of night birds and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. I had a letter from Rebecca today, Rose said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. They've settled in San Francisco. Her husband's position at the hotel is going well. Mason tensed slightly. Are they still expecting you to join them? Rose turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. Rebecca asked if I would like to. She says there's plenty of room in their new house, and the hotel could use someone with bookkeeping experience. Mason's heart sank, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. I see. And what did you tell her? I haven't replied yet, Rose said. I wanted to talk to you first. Hope flickered in Mason's chest. Oh? Rose set aside the shawl she had been crocheting and turned to face him fully. Mason, these past months, since Thomas died, I never thought I could feel happy again. I was just trying to survive, to find a way to care for the baby. But then I came here, and you... She paused, seeming to search for the right words. You gave me more than just a place to stay. You gave me a home. You made me feel safe, valued. You've been so good with Thomas, so patient with me. She took a deep breath. What I'm trying to say is that I don't want to go to San Francisco. I want to stay here if you'll have us. The hope in Mason's chest blazed into joy. If I'll have you, Rose, nothing would make me happier. He took her hands in his. I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day in town, when you stood up to Mrs. Hargrove with such dignity despite everything. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness. I love you too, Mason. I wasn't looking for love again so soon, but it found me anyway. Mason lifted one hand to cup her cheek gently. Are you sure? About staying? About us? I don't want to rush you if you're not ready. Rose leaned into his touch. I'm sure. Thomas would want me to be happy, to give our son a father who loves him, and I can't imagine being happier anywhere other than here, with you. This time when Mason kissed her, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss was tender, but filled with all the love and promise they felt for each other. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. Mrs. Blackett has a nice ring to it, Mason said softly. Rose laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. Is that a proposal, Mr. Blackett? It could be, Mason replied, his eyes twinkling. If you'd be interested in such an offer. I might be, Rose teased, then grew serious. But are you sure? Taking on another man's child. Thomas is not another man's child to me, Mason said firmly. He's your son, and that makes him precious to me. I already love him, Rose, and I want to be his father in every way that matters. Rose's heart swelled with love for this man who had opened his home and his heart to her and her son. Then yes, Mason Blackett, I would be very interested in becoming your wife. The smile that lit Mason's face was radiant. He leaned in to kiss her again, sealing their promise to each other as the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear in the Texas sky. The wedding took place in September, when Thomas was nearly 4 months old and the worst heat of the Texas summer had begun to subside. It was a simple ceremony held at the ranch, with Dr. Harmon's wife playing the piano and Mrs. Finch crying openly throughout. The ranch hands had decorated the house and yard with wildflowers and ribbons, and a feast had been prepared that would feed everyone for days. Even Mrs. Hargrove from the boarding house attended, her earlier disapproval apparently forgotten, as she cooed over baby Thomas. Rose wore a dress of pale blue silk that had once belonged to Mason's mother, altered by Mrs. Finch to fit her smaller frame. Her honey-brown hair was adorned with white flowers, and she carried a bouquet of roses from the garden Elizabeth Blackett had planted years ago. Mason, watching her walk toward him in the dappled shade of the oak trees where they had chosen to exchange their vows, thought he had never seen anyone more beautiful. The months at the ranch had erased the signs of exhaustion and worry from Rose's face, replacing them with a glow of health and happiness that transformed her from pretty to truly lovely. Thomas, dressed in a miniature suit that Mrs. Finch had sewn specially for the occasion, was cradled in the arms of one of the ranch wives, gurgling happily as if he understood the significance of the day. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with Mason and Rose exchanging vows they had written themselves. Mason promised to love both Rose and Thomas, to provide for them and protect them, to be a true husband and father in every sense of the words. Rose, her voice steady despite the tears shining in her eyes, promised to love and support Mason, to make a home with him, to raise their family together on the land he loved so much. When it was done and they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, the cheers and applause could probably be heard all the way to Brownsville. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than even the hungry ranch hands could consume. Rose and Mason moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, always finding their way back to each other's side as if drawn by an invisible force. As the festivities began to wind down, Mason found Rose sitting on the porch, Thomas sleeping in her arms. He joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders and drawing her close. "Happy, Mrs. Blackett?" he asked softly. Rose leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "And you?" "I never knew it was possible to be this happy," Mason admitted. "You and Thomas. You've given me a family again. You've made the ranch a home." Rose smiled, looking out at the land that had become so dear to her. In just a few months, the Blackett Ranch had transformed from a refuge to a true home. She thought of the first day when Mason had found her desperate and alone in Brownsville, how he had offered shelter with those simple words. "My ranch needs a family." "You were right, you know," she said, glancing up at him. "That first day when you said the ranch needed a family, it did, and so did I." Mason pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We all did, and now we have one." As twilight deepened into night, the stars appearing one by one in the vast Texas sky, Rose and Mason sat in the comfortable silence, their son sleeping peacefully between them. The future stretched before them, full of promise, more children perhaps, years of working the land together, building on what Mason's parents had started. There would be challenges, of course. Life on a ranch was never easy. There would be drought years and cattle diseases, market fluctuations, and the constant hard work of taming the land. But they would face it together, as a family. For Rose, who had once been a desperate widow with nowhere to go, the Blackett Ranch had become more than just a safe haven. It had become the place where she found love again, where she would raise her son, where she would build a life she had never dared to dream of after Thomas's death. And for Mason, the lonely rancher who had opened his home to a stranger in need, Rose and Thomas had filled the emptiness left by the losses of war and time. The ranch that had once echoed with memories of what was gone now rang with the promise of what was to come. As the last of their wedding guests departed and they prepared to begin their life together as husband and wife, Both Rose and Mason knew with absolute certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged with each other, on this land, building a family together. The pregnant widow had found not just somewhere to go, but somewhere to belong. And the cowboy who had said, "My ranch needs a family," had found that, and more, he had found his heart's home in Rose and Thomas. Years passed, and the Blackett Ranch prospered. Thomas grew from an infant to a sturdy toddler, then to a curious boy with his mother's blue eyes and his biological father's quick smile. He followed Mason everywhere, soaking up knowledge of the ranch and its operations like a sponge. "He's a natural horseman," Mason told Rose proudly when Thomas was 5, and riding his own pony with remarkable skill for his age. "Takes to it like he was born in the saddle." Rose watched them together, her heart full. Mason had been true to his word, loving Thomas as his own son in every way. The boy called him Pa and looked up to him with adoration, never knowing that the man who raised him wasn't his biological father. Rose and Mason had decided they would tell him the truth when he was old enough to understand. But for now, they were simply a family that had grown. 2 years after their wedding, Rose gave birth to a son they named Michael, after Mason's brother. 2 years after that came Elizabeth, named for Mason's mother. The house that had once seemed too quiet to Mason now rang with children's laughter and the happy chaos of family life. Mrs. Finch, now in her 70s but still spry, had moved into a small cottage Mason built for her on the ranch property. "Can't have those children growing up without me to spoil them properly," she had declared. She had become a beloved grandmother figure to all 3 children, telling them stories of the early days of the ranch and teaching them her special recipes. The ranch itself had continued to expand under Mason and Rose's joint management. Rose's head for figures complemented Mason's practical knowledge of cattle and horses, making them a formidable team. They had purchased additional land, increased the size of the herd, and established the Blackett horses as some of the most sought after in Texas. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Mason surprised Rose with a gift, the deed to a parcel of land adjacent to the ranch house, where he proposed to build a school. "A proper school," he explained as Rose stared at the papers in amazement. "For our children and the children of the hands, like my mother always wanted." "Mason, that's wonderful," Rose said, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "But who would teach? The nearest qualified teacher is in Brownsville, and that's too far to travel daily." Mason smiled. "I was hoping you might consider it. You've done such a good job teaching our children their letters and numbers. And you've mentioned more than once how you enjoyed helping Thomas's schoolwork." Rose was stunned by the suggestion. "Me? A teacher? Why not? You're educated, patient, and the children adore you. We could start small, just a few hours each day. Mrs. Finch could watch Elizabeth while you teach, and as the children get older, we could perhaps hire a proper schoolmarm from back east." Rose considered the idea, finding it increasingly appealing the more she thought about it. She had always valued education, and the opportunity to provide it for not just her own children but those of the ranch workers was deeply satisfying. "I think I'd like that very much," she said finally, smiling at her husband. "Thank you for believing in me." Mason took her hands in his. "I've believed in you since the day I met you, Rose. You're the strongest, most capable woman I know. This ranch, this family, none of it would be what it is without you." Rose leaned in to kiss him, still amazed after 10 years at the depth of love she felt for this man who had offered her a home when she had nowhere else to go. Their life together hadn't always been easy. There had been drought years and difficult births, arguments and reconciliations, all the normal challenges of building a life together. But through it all, their love had only deepened and strengthened, like roots growing firmly into the Texas soil. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Thomas, now nearly 10 and every inch his father's son, despite their lack of blood connection, Michael, 7, and already showing Mason's affinity for horses, and Elizabeth, 5, a tiny whirlwind with her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's determination, Rose felt a contentment so complete it almost overwhelmed her. "I was thinking," Mason said, interrupting her reverie, "about what you said all those years ago, about my ranch needing a family." Rose smiled at the memory. "Your exact words were, 'My ranch needs a family,' as I recall." Mason nodded, his eyes on their children. "I had no idea then how right those words would turn out to be, or how much I needed a family too." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. Thank you, Rose, for staying, for loving me, for giving me more than I ever dreamed possible. Rose reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. Thank you for asking me to stay, for loving Thomas as your own, for being the kind of man who would offer shelter to a pregnant widow with nowhere to go. As the sun set over the Blackett Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Rose reflected on the strange and wonderful path her life had taken. From the depths of grief and desperation to the heights of love and family, from having nowhere to go to finding a place she belonged so completely, it was as if she had always been meant to be here. The pregnant widow had found not just shelter, but a true home. The cowboy had found not just a family for his ranch, but the love of his life. And together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the gathering twilight, with the man she loved beside her and their children playing nearby, Rose Blackett said a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, to this place, to this family, to this life that had surpassed her wildest dreams. The Blackett Ranch would always be more than just a successful cattle operation. It would always be more than just a piece of Texas land. It would be a home, built on love and strengthened by family, exactly what the ranch had needed all along.